And thanks for joining. My name is Kerry Holden. I'm a member of staff in the School of Geography, and my research area is related to sort of science and technology, and in particular I do a lot of research in Africa, in East Africa, in Uganda and Kenya. So looking forward to talking about infrastructures with you. Hi, you have to bear with me. I've been a little bit ill over the last couple of days, so I'm not 100%, but I'm really looking forward to talking through infrastructures with you, and sort of thinking about infrastructures a bit differently. And the reason why I sort of am talking on this topic, one is because I teach on it. So I run a course in the 3rd year, which is an optional module, which is called Geography, Technology and Society. And in that we do a lot of work around infrastructures, thinking differently about infrastructures. And also it's not something that you're readily introduced to necessarily, or readily called to think about and to discuss and debate. And in this talk, that's kind of what I want to do, is to kind of open up your thinking about infrastructures, to go beyond perhaps looking at them as simply feats of engineering or kind of material objects in the world like bridges, to thinking about them as having social and political dimensions. So that's kind of the reason why I wanted to talk about this topic, and they are really, really interesting once we start to untangle and unpick how infrastructure shape the worlds in which we live, and also and us, how we think about ourselves in the world and facilitate lots of the things that we do. Of course, we couldn't live without electricity or clean water, for example. So it's to get you into thinking differently and to thinking and approaching infrastructures from the perspective of, say, a human geographer. So in this talk, I'm going to sort of go through different ways in which geographers have approached infrastructures and the kind of questions that they ask. And I'm going to introduce you to some of the research that's done in the department, as well as some of the teaching, particularly on the field work courses. So I'd like you to feel free to interject at any point if you have any questions. There's some questions in the slides that we could open up for debate, and feel free to use the chat if you want to ask a question. I'd like it to be somewhat interactive, but I know that that can be quite difficult online, so do feel free to just interject at any time. So first of all, I'll ask the question for you guys, like, what do we think infrastructures are? How do we think about them generally? Well, we often think about them as made up of hard materials and having a kind of physical form in the world. So when someone says infrastructures, we might jump to transportation networks such as roads or railway lines. We might think about critical infrastructures that provide us with clean water, sanitation and electricity. Or we might jump to communication networks such as fibre optic cables, data centres that enable us to get online and to communicate with each other. In some, though, what we can say about infrastructures is that they make our lives possible. They circulate goods and services around our society. They deliver things to us. They make sure that we can go to work, we can travel, etc., or we can shop. And they also have a sort of global dimension. Infrastructure stretch across the globe. So if you were to imagine, so let's do a little thought exercise. If you were to imagine all the infrastructures that you interacted with today from getting up this morning, it probably will produce a very sort of deep, complex image of layers of infrastructure that you have interacted with today, from, say, switching the kettle on to taking a shower to getting online. You've interacted with lots of different layers of infrastructure. So infrastructure, you're saturated in infrastructures that crisscross your lives, and they exist on a big scale. So you think about an electricity grid is national, it's international, and on a depth too, you're interacting a lot with historical infrastructures too, like roads, streets, etc. And we're not often asked to think about this, to think readily about the kinds of infrastructures that we interact with, that we touch, and that we sort of have a relationship with on an everyday basis, from flicking a switch to turning a tap on. We're not really thinking about the masses of infrastructure that's behind that, the systems of pipes, wires, construction, machines, etc. We're not really thinking about how that all works. And we often do see infrastructure as simply feats of engineering and technology and the sort of composite of materials in the world. And we often notice infrastructure, as Susan Lee Starr commented over 20 years ago, we often notice infrastructures when they fail, when they are disrupted. So we think about if a train fails or misses, is delayed, we often notice the infrastructural problems. But if things are working well, i.e. the lights are going on, water's working, we often don't notice infrastructure. It becomes part of our everyday lives. And just to sort of, I like this example a lot that I wanted to introduce you to, just to get you thinking about the scale and the depth of infrastructures. This is an image here, and you can access it by Googling anatomy of AI. It's a sort of, it's a chart that depicts the scale of Amazon's Alexa AI system. So the chart shows the life cycle of Alexa, from the mining of rare earth minerals in different parts of the world, to the building of components that make up the machine, to its machine learning function, and to it becoming waste. So Alexa, sort of throughout the life cycle of a device like the Alexa AI, goes through lots of different infrastructures, or depends on lots of different infrastructures to make it possible. And the scale of the infrastructures that it interacts with are on a global level, and they're also kind of very deep as well. They have a great deal of depth in society, from, let's say, the kind of behavioral science that informs machine learning, how Alexa learns about its environment, and how it uses data, for example. So it's really worth having a look at the anatomy of AI, and I included it here because I think it's a very interesting example of how we might capture the life cycle of an infrastructure or even a piece of technology to understand its social and its political dimensions. So this chart shows us the life cycle from mining to waste, but it also shows comparisons in it, for example, in the kinds of wages that are awarded to people who work across this spectrum. And it's always quite striking, of course, that the CEO of Amazon earns, I don't know, millions in a year compared to miners who earn very little, not even a sort of minimum or livable wage. So you've got this great big discrepancy within this chart too, that opens up a kind of social stratification upon which this device also depends. So it's on display in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And as part of the New York field trip, we have an opportunity to sort of go and visit and go and have a look at this chart, and to think about how you might map other sort of technologies or other infrastructures on it. How might you understand their life cycle and why it's important to do that? So we want to think about going beyond this idea that infrastructures are merely technical feats or feats of engineering, and that they're only made up of material objects. And we arrive at the question of why geographers are interested in infrastructures. How do we approach infrastructure, and why do we study it? Well, one is to sort of grasp the scale and the depth, and to pull open those social and political dimensions, to showcase, you know, how infrastructures, that we should think about them, how infrastructures or promote equality or justice, or the ethics that infrastructures have. So geographers are interested in infrastructures because they are global, in the sense that many infrastructures are made by materials that are coming from different parts of the world. Components are made in different parts of the world. Capital, money and investment comes from lots of different parts of the world. So in the construction and the building of infrastructures, they are global. And they also promote globalization, or they mobilize globalization. Sure, infrastructures are vital to the circulation of global capital, of trade and industry across the globe. So there's that dimension that's really important, the sort of globalization dimension, which I think many of you will be studying at A-level and thinking about how globalization happens. And of course, infrastructures are really important to that. Infrastructures are also political, and we'll look at how they're political in two senses. And one, infrastructure shapes space, bridges, roads, they divide up and they organize space in particular ways that can allow access to some people and discriminate against others. And they're also political projects. So we'll look at how infrastructures become invested in political projects. As I've just stated, infrastructure shapes society and communities. They can bound societies and communities, or they can limit access. Or, you know, societies and communities can map on ideals and use infrastructure in a way that promotes their interests. Infrastructures, importantly for geographers, become sites of inequality and injustice, to see how inequality and injustice are working in places and spaces across the world. Infrastructures are deeply historical and have links to colonialism, particularly some global infrastructures. And also, when we start studying infrastructures, how people use them, how communities relate to them, we see that they are retooled and reused in extraordinary ways. So we might ask, there's some work that's done asking the question of when is a pipe a water pipe, not a water pipe. So how do different kinds of communities make use of different kinds of infrastructures? So is there any questions so far? Hopefully I'm not going too fast either. So before we get into sort of these different sort of approaches that geographers take to understanding infrastructures, I want to look at the kinds of methods that geographers use in studying them. And this is a combination of methods that are in both human geography and in physical geography as well, sort of bringing the two parts of the discipline together. So in human geography, we often use ethnography, which is a form of participant observation, which means actually kind of going and hanging out or immersing yourself in the communities around particular infrastructures, or being part of an infrastructure, which sounds quite strange in a way, but there's a very nice ethnography of road building in South America, where the researchers, they basically lived by the road for a long time and talked to lots of people who were building it, as well as communities that were affected by it. There's other people in where I do research in East Africa, who have been living in the kind of data communities and observing data infrastructures in Nairobi, for example. So there's lots of, although it sounds a bit peculiar to sort of do participant observation around a piece of infrastructure because it seems like a hard object, it is a quite interesting way to see how a road or a viaduct or a particular kind of critical infrastructure like an electricity grid, for example, is experienced by different communities. So ethnography provides us with a nice tool to kind of live with infrastructure and understand what that means. Human geographers also use a lot of interviewing. So interviewing people that are building infrastructures, or interviewing people who are affected or impacted by them, the different kinds of communities that gather around a new infrastructure. Many of you might have seen on the news around, let's say, HS2, the railway line that's being built. You had a lot of controversy about the environmental impacts of the HS2 railway that was protested against by environmental groups. So, you know, you might interview different stakeholders in the building of a piece of infrastructure that would include campaigners as well as policymakers. So there's lots of different people in different positions, from, let's say, government policymaking to science and engineering to environmentalism that you can interact with, often around big infrastructures, particularly the ones that do have an impact on communities, like the building of power stations or the building of railway lines. So often, like, so this is on the human side, where you have these what we call these qualitative methods of talking to people and interacting with them and trying to understand how an infrastructure is coming into being, coming into place, and how it's shaping and impacting that place. So combined with those methods in human geography, geographers also use data. So geographic information systems, which are very, very important to infrastructures getting built in terms of mapping, layers of mapping the land, and modelling it as well, understanding the environmental impacts of trying to predict them. So GIS becomes a really interesting method in terms of the visualization and the modelling of environments and the modelling of communities that might be impacted by the building of infrastructures. And this can lead to sort of some work around what's called critical data science and mapping, where you might use other data sources, historic data sources, in order to sort of build a bigger, more nuanced picture of how a piece of infrastructure is going to impact a community or is going to extend a city in some way. So critical data science is often concerned with infrastructures, building infrastructures for sustainability and for social good and for justice as well. So it's often using data and layering up data in order to develop more sort of sustainable and more just forms of infrastructure. But interestingly, approaches to studying infrastructures in geography use methods that are in both human and physical geography to build up a very sort of complex picture, and also to capture an understanding of how infrastructures change space and place, but also how infrastructures are experienced and interacted with by the people that they impact. So infrastructures can become almost like tools to think with in approaching a series of key issues in geography around, let's say, equality, justice, environmentalism, and society. Infrastructures are very good sites for exploring what are key questions and challenges in human geography. Any questions at all? Okay, great. So I'm going to go through now the sort of different approaches that geographers take and the different issues that they unpick from studying infrastructures. And then I'll conclude. And there are some questions in here too. So, and if you have any further questions that you want to ask, please just interject in the chat. That's no problem. So the first kind of issue that we can look to infrastructures to try to understand is globalization. And infrastructures drive and mobilize globalization. If you think about shipping corridors, you think about air travel, so the circulation, and we come back to what infrastructures are in a way. They're often sort of primarily perceived as being about the circulation of goods and services. So infrastructures facilitate that at a global level. And we also, our lives are also kind of bound up with globalization as well. So infrastructures are key to driving and mobilizing globalizing processes by sort of circulating goods and services around the globe. But they are also, in and of themselves, they represent globalization. They are global. Often infrastructures are financed by global interests and their access to capital. So you think about public-private investments in infrastructures. They're often built using materials that are extracted from different parts of the world and processed in many different parts of the world. So the components of infrastructures are built across the globe, in factories across the globe. They employ lots of different forms of expertise, from design to development to construction, and forms of labour, particularly in their construction. And often infrastructures have to comply with standards and practices that are set at international levels and that emerge in international law, which becomes something that I'm particularly interested in, what you might call a kind of soft infrastructure of legal knowledge and of regulation. So for a really good example is, if you think about, why is the credit card or your bank card a certain thickness, that it can be used everywhere in the world? So there's lots of, if you think about anything really from, I'm trying to think of another example, my mind is drawing a blank, but so the stairs, for example, the width, or maybe that's not the best example actually, stairs are steps, but yeah, maybe I'll come back to it. Sorry, I'm a bit off my game today, but I'm sure that you can think of examples of where, you know, standardization occurs. I mean, if you walk through any airport in the world, there's lots of standards that are perhaps not always visible, but are actually sort of inbuilt into the airports and into sort of like planes, and that mean that you can fly to anywhere in the world, and you go through similar processes in a way. So there's lots of that kind of soft, what we might call administrative or bureaucratic infrastructure. That means that things can be done in similar ways across the world. So in the department, sorry, I just got to move the chat box. So in the department, in the module that I teach in Geography, Technology and Society, which is the third year optional module, we explore the globalizing dimensions of infrastructure, looking in particular at this, what we might call an ethnography of expertise and infrastructure, that explores the building of 2 roads in Peru, and it was written by 2 scholars called Penny Harvey and Hannah Knox in 2015. And it's a really interesting insight into these roads as being the focus of international investment and global expertise, lots of different experts coming in from around the world to help build the road. And the expertise is in engineering and mathematics predominantly, in terms of building mountain roads and understanding, being able to map the environment and build a stable road in high altitude environments. So one of the roads leads into the mountains, and the other road that they focus on is called the Interoceanic Highway, which stretches from the Atlantic coast of Brazil all the way to the Pacific coast of Peru. And this is a sort of a highway which is going to facilitate continental trade in South America. So they're connecting a lot of concerns around how, you know, the roads facilitate globalization, what happens to communities that are dotted along the road, how are they going to benefit, which presumably they will, because the trade will be extended to them. But at the same time, there are questions around whether or not that's a good thing, whether or not it produces more inequalities and more commercial practices in remote regions. So they explore lots of different questions around the building of these roads and what these roads promise in terms of extended trade, but also like what comes with that as well. What happens to these communities? How might they be affected, and how might they change? And in the department, we have a scholar, Dr. Carlo Inverardi Ferries. His work examines the life of solar power across the globe in 3 different sites. So he looks at the sort of social life, if you like, of something like renewable energy in the form of solar panels and solar power, considering how the materials to make up a solar panel, how they're mined, where they mined, what conditions are they mined in, what kinds of labor do they require to do this, how rare earth minerals are then used to construct components, where does that happen in the world. Again, what kinds of labour does that require? What kinds of international networks open up? Oh, sorry. Oh, and also how solar, he then moves on to look at how solar panels and solar power is used in different communities as a sort of off-grid. So this is considering poorer communities who perhaps don't have access to a national electricity grid, so they don't have access to a national infrastructure providing electricity like we do. So solar becomes a really good renewable resource that's off-grid, that can service a small community. And then he explores again waste, how solar panels become waste. Where does this waste end up? Who deals with it? So he's examining, like, say, the social life of something like the solar panel in different stages of its life cycle, and thinking about who interacts with it, what kinds of labour facilitate it, what kinds of networks across the globe are important. And I can see someone's, Ethan H has said mobile phone, so which I'm not sure if that's, if you're sort of thinking about the kinds of infrastructures that are necessitated by the mobile phone, the kind of, which are indeed global and rely even on the colonization of space, if you like, so the sort of satellite technologies too, and the data centers. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if that's what you're thinking by writing mobile phone. But there's some interesting work that goes on in the department among scholars, like thinking about, you know, infrastructures in a social, like embedding them in their social fabric, their social context and their historical context, and to think about the different dimensions of that. And Carlo looks in particular at labour and at sort of international capital and investment, and how that produces inequalities. So of course, you know, miners of rare earth minerals are earning much less than those producing solar panels. So next, what I want to move on to is thinking about the politics of infrastructures. And this is another approach, and it's often referred to as technopolitics, or in some discussions, the technopolitics. And the main question is, how do artifacts like bridges, like roads, different forms of infrastructure, which appear as hard objects all around us, how do they have politics? Do they have politics? And this emerges from the work of the seminal, very influential work of a scholar called Langdon Winner, who wrote way back in 1980, so way back when, he wrote about this. He asked the question, and it's here in this quote from his work: what are the specific ways in which infrastructures embody specific forms of power and authority? And on the New York field trip, this is one of our questions to ask when we're actually in New York. And there's a very famous example in New York, because in the mid-century, New York was designed by the planner Robert Moses, and quite an infamous figure in New York's history. And he was very famous for creating lots of the viaducts and lots of the freeways that divide up the city. So the Bronx Expressway, the Long Island Expressway too. And in the Long Island Expressway, you'll see here from a picture from it that it has these very low bridges, and the intention was, in building these low bridges, that you would not permit buses or sort of vehicles of height to pass through. And the argument, like later people looked at this and said, well, it actually cut off the city to people who relied on the bus to get into the city, is that they couldn't take the expressway. So Langdon Winner actually sort of studies this and argues that Robert Moses held very sort of racist points of view, and he was also highly discriminatory against poorer communities. And he wanted to transform Manhattan into a sort of a city of wealth and opportunity, And what this meant, of course, was that you block off the city to certain communities, and arguably the Long Island Expressway with its low bridges actually does that. So Winner takes this example of these low bridges. Well, he takes them as an example of where artifacts have politics, that they divide up places and they create exclusions, or they create challenges or obstacles to enjoying the city or having the right to the city. So in New York, when we do the field trip, we actually observe how different kinds of infrastructures, what impacts and effects they might have on particular kinds of communities. So it's thinking, so in one sense, thinking about the politics of infrastructure is thinking about how they divide up space. How do they cut into space and create barriers and challenges in different ways for people to move and mobilize, or how do they persuade or shepherd people in particular directions? And it's worth kind of remembering then that that's exactly what infrastructures do. They do carve up space, and they do organize space in particular ways so that we inhabit it, we ourselves are mobilized in particular ways and can access particular parts of particular urban environment. Another way, another approach to the politics of infrastructure is to think about the political geographies of infrastructure. And this relates to infrastructures as government projects. They more often than not are government sponsored or government commissioned projects. And we can think of the HS2 train line perhaps as a good example of a new infrastructure aimed at connecting to the northern powerhouse cities of Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, with this idea that they will increase economic growth in those regions by extending infrastructure to them in the form of a train line. So the political geographies of infrastructure are about just that, like thinking through infrastructures as government projects. And in many ways, that's kind of looking at the ways in which infrastructural developments are commissioned by governments, which involves lots and lots of expertise and deliberation and reporting on why do we want to build this particular train line, what is it going to deliver, what kind of estimates are we looking at, how is it going to do that. So reporting includes lots of justifications of why we would want to perhaps invest in a new infrastructure at the national level, and they're often promoted as a national project. So HS2 again is a very good example because it's promoted as a national project that kind of brings together the nation, the different regions, and perhaps the regions that have not been invested in as much as London to sort of resolve a north-south divide in the UK. So we can also think about infrastructures as doing political work, binding parts of countries together or extending infrastructure to parts of countries that are seen as lacking investment or deprived in some way. Is seen as a solution to those problems. So on the one hand, geographers actually look at the ways in which infrastructures are commissioned. So we'll look at, who informs the HS2 project. It's been deliberated on a lot. There's been a lot of reports down the line that have contested it even to showcase that it is not worth, it's perhaps not worth the money that has been invested in it. So you can look at different sources of information here, from policies to reporting at the government level, to see who is informing how we make decisions about infrastructure and how are they promoted as national projects. What kinds of ideas of national economic growth or of society do they have invested in them, or are they projecting? So for HS2, of course, it's projecting a connected UK with investment going north as well as to London. I think someone else has got another question, but I can't, not sure I can see it.
Would you like me to read it out, Kerry?
Yeah, it's not come up for me.
No worries. Ethan says, fascinating to hear about infrastructures being political, like the Long Island Expressway. Is there any examples in the UK?
Oh, that's a good question. I would put it back to you, actually, because we all have experiences of different infrastructures. So are there any that you think of, you know, kind of promoted inclusions, or, you know, permitted access, more access, or are there any that you think are problematic? So, and actually a good example in the UK is that John May, a professor in the department, studied homelessness for a while, and one of the things that he found in cities, thinking about how people are housed in cities or where people sleep in cities, is that in many places, benches that once, you know, were kind of like, I think, smooth, or kind of, but what he saw was that public benches in public parts of the city often had dividers on them, like newer benches. They came with dividers on them so that you couldn't sleep on them. And this was also part of a kind of regeneration project. So you think about places like Spitalfields or Paddington Basin, for example, these sort of parts of London that have been regenerated. Is that often you walk around and you see you're not exposed to people who are homeless or people who are dehoused. Like there's an idea that they don't belong in these spaces, or they can't be kind of supported in these spaces. And John May actually looked at how infrastructures did that. How did they, let's say, kind of cleanse parts of the city? And one of the ways is that you create dividers on seating so that people can't sleep on them. So I think that's kind of an interesting example if you're walking around London. And it's worth just kind of taking note as well as you walk around, because you all experience infrastructure. Yeah, there you go. Spikes outside businesses. Yeah. So there's lots. I mean, design is really important, like infrastructural design. And if you just look at any infrastructural design, you'll see how it's got an idea of the kind of community it wants to promote, or you know, the kind of environment it wants to exist in, it wants to create in a way. So, and in many regeneration projects, I mean, if you look at just images around regeneration, it's of lots of greenery, lots of conviviality, lots of people mingling in really interesting ways, but not kind of, you don't get any kind of poverty or in those images, or any sense that you get a very sort of convivial urban existence that's imagined. I hope that answers your question. But it's a good question, and it's worth just kind of, you know, using your skills as a geographer in just walking around and taking note of design features that might lead to exclusion, like people being excluded from places. So just to get back to the politics, the political geographies, on the one hand, infrastructures, and I'm aware of time now. So on the one hand, infrastructures, yeah, they are government projects, and on the other hand, they require regulation. And this to me is totally fascinating, and one area that I'm paying particular attention to right now is the AI debate. What kind of regulation do we need for AI globally? And it seems to be put at that level, that this is a global intervention into a technology that is running away from us, but also technology that requires vast infrastructures. So data infrastructures, because AI exists on data. It needs volumes of data produced through mobile phones, the internet, interactions to learn. So we're talking about these vast global infrastructures of satellites, data centers, so fiber optic cables, storage centers, etc., that have to exist for AI to work too. So and I find it fascinating that governments are often, you know, having to produce new regulation or create new laws for new forms of infrastructure and new technologies with that too. So another good example of where regulation is required is the building of a nuclear power station, which has to meet international regulations and standards around security and operations of nuclear power. And also nuclear power is seen as an alternative power source to the carbon. So it has to sort of meet international treaties and be in compliance with them, but also, you know, it has to be securitized, which requires really, really, very tight regulations around it. So again, if you've got a new technology, a new infrastructure emerging, you might want to think about, well, how are governments going to regulate it so that it's safe and it's efficient, it actually is productive for society? And that's often a question that governments are faced with and having to deal with on a regular basis. So how do you produce policies that will help you to govern actually effectively and manage infrastructures and their impacts on society? So we can think about the political geographies of infrastructures as one. These are often political projects. Infrastructures, new infrastructures are often political projects, but also that they require regulations and laws. And again, we come back to that kind of soft infrastructure around law, administration, management. So infrastructures are not simply technical feats or made of materials. They also need a legal infrastructure, they need regulation, they need managing, they need operationalizing. So they go beyond being just material, let's say. Oh. So, and how long do I have, Sadia?
Hi, Kerry. It's fine. We've got about 15 minutes, but it's okay if we go slightly over, no problem.
So another approach, of course, thinking about globalization and thinking about politics and infrastructures, that we also think about them socially as well. The infrastructures are embedded within social fabrics, often forming society, as well as being impacted by society. They change within their social context. So geographers explore infrastructures and societies in two dominant ways. One is to look at how infrastructures perpetuate inequalities and injustice in society. And then secondly, in thinking about how ideals of how to live together and how to live together well and to live together democratically are mapped onto infrastructures. So infrastructures often carry promises of connection, of democracy, and of economic growth. And I want to just refer you to work done in the department. So my own work in East Africa looks at a project or part of some of the research that I've done in Kenya, in Nairobi, its capital city, is around a project called the Digital Matatus Project. And there's an image of the map there and an image of the Matatu buses. If you're not familiar, in Nairobi, there isn't really a sort of centralized public form of transport, like transport for London or, you know, local buses or transport around cities. A lot of transport around Nairobi is provided by what's called the Matatu buses, and these are privately owned buses, and they're often very colourful and very decorative, and they sort of run around the city, and there's lots and lots of them. And the Digital Matatus project was designed to collect data on the Matatu buses and produce a map like the one that you can see there just about. And the map was to indicate routes and times. And within this, I mean, there's some problems with the map, but within it, the idea was that Nairobi is representative of an African city that is chaotic and congested, and that if you produce this digital map, you'll create order and efficiency in Nairobi's roads. So it'll improve urban life for many residents. They'll be able to get across the city better if you can see the matatus, if you can see the bus routes, and if you can see the times. So within the map carries with it a sort of ideal about how Nairobi should run, how its transportation should run. So, and these are sort of like, if you think there's many sort of infrastructural projects that are designed with ideals of order and efficiency within them. So they promote what we might call an imaginary of what life could be like. So to go back to HS2 as well, that carries this imaginary of connecting the north of England to the south, to sites of investment, routes of investment, and to promote economic growth. So there's this sort of imaginary which opens up. So we're interested in these imaginaries. They're kind of fictions, they're kind of stories of infrastructure, and that sort of sits on the humanities side of the discipline too, is to sort of start reading the stories that infrastructures tell. And hopefully that's sort of any questions about that idea. It's quite a complicated idea to think about, understand, you know, stories. Where do we find stories, for example? And often we find them in the policy documents, or we find them in speeches where you've got politicians talking about a particular infrastructural project. With the digital Matatus, you can go to the digital Matatus website and you can read their vision statement, and their vision statement is very imaginary. It's very that this project will deliver efficiency and order to Nairobi. So it imagines Nairobi differently. In terms of understanding sort of how infrastructures perpetuate inequalities, Dr. Niranjana Ramesh explores water infrastructures in the coastal city of Chennai, India. And she looks at how access to water shapes the city, but also how it's informed and perpetuates a caste system. So it forms a sort of environmentally, it becomes a case of environmental injustice in terms of who has access to water and who doesn't. So the way that we organize a vital, a critical infrastructure, let's say like clean water, mirrors societal differences and stratification and perpetuates them. And that is a particular interest to lots of geographers thinking about environmental racism and environmental justice, that you look at how infrastructures have been positioned or built historically, and they often perpetuate or they produce social differences and inequalities. So I've just got to move things around on my screen. I'm just going to close the chat a bit because I can't see my screen completely. So in addition to thinking about society, so far we've thought about infrastructures as part of globalization, as being global, the politics of infrastructures and the political geographies of infrastructures and society, and we'll come back to some of those points around inequality because they're really important. But also infrastructures are important sites in which to explore human and environment relationships in geography, which is a key part of geography as a discipline, is to think about the environment in relation to human societies. And in the New York field trip, we spend time on the High Line, which is pictured here, thinking about sustainable urban infrastructures in regenerating the city and why they're important. So the High Line is promoted as a sustainable design feature that allows residents to walk from a part of the city to another part on a sort of raised, it used to be a railway line, it's kind of a raised track that is now filled with, as you can see, sort of plants and sort of walkways and seating. It's quite leisurely. And it's to promote this idea that you're in a kind of urban nature as well. So much of the planting along the High Line is to mimic a kind of a wilderness effect. It looks quite wild. It's not as kind of curated as maybe a garden. So, and that is deliberate to create this sort of wild wilderness effect in a major city. And it also promotes the idea of sustainability, that it's built with materials that are sustainable, or it in itself maintaining it. It has a sort of sustainability goal. So the questions that we ask on the New York field trip when we walk through the High Line is in thinking about the future of cities, and New York is a city that sits in the North Atlantic. It's subject to Atlantic surge, and you might remember, you might be too young to remember Hurricane Sandy that hit New York and flooded the whole of the southern part of Manhattan. So it is at risk. It is a city that is acknowledged to be at risk of the impacts of climate change in terms of flooding and Atlantic surge. So how do you mitigate in a city? How do you create new infrastructures that can mitigate and adapt to climate change? And that's a really key area of urban design, is how do you create new infrastructure that can mitigate and adapt to climate change conditions? And what futures are at stake in building sustainable infrastructures? So in a major city like Manhattan, the High Line and Little Island are kind of another sort of feature that's on one of the piers, are built with this idea of creating natural spaces in the city that promote sustainability or promote a kind of environmental thinking. And then if you go to the southern part of Manhattan, when we head down to Battery Park, you see the flood defense systems, which are huge kind of concrete structures that are there to mitigate against climate change, whereas you could say that the High Line is there to adapt to climate change, or to get people to think more about being sustainable and being environmentally aware in a big city. So this is kind of like a really, I think, really interesting set of questions that has particular resonance if any of you were thinking that you wanted to, you know, develop a career in urban design. I think this is probably one of the key areas, sustainable design in cities, big cities like London, like New York, that in many ways are, you know, producing a lot of carbon each year. They have huge carbon footprints and rely on huge infrastructures in energy. So how do we change cities for the better? So I think that's like a key question that we actually pursue on the New York field trip. And by contrast as well, in New York, if you go upriver a bit, it's dotted with what are called Superfund sites. And these are heavy polluted environments due to industrial expansion actually servicing the city. So creating the kind of industry that would serve the city and allow it to grow, but they produce toxic environments that are predominantly impacting poorer communities. And there's a lot of campaigning in New York around Superfund sites to have them cleaned, and actually to understand the kinds of environmental justice at stake here, like who's affected by these toxic spaces. So one is to think about the geographies of toxicity here, and who is impacted by these spaces, and how do they enact change? And often it is through long-standing campaigns. So we're interested in that too, because the High Line is quite a long way from a Superfund site. The High Line is a very nice, leisurely, urban nature, if you like, that you can stroll down in a very expensive, very gentrified part of Manhattan. It's kind of a long way from understanding a Superfund site that causes high rates of illness amongst particular communities because of levels of toxicity in the water table or in the soil. So these are kind of contrasting sites to think about. How can we, as geographers, how are we invested in making or understanding infrastructures to promote sustainability and environmental awareness? Ooh, so this leads on to thinking through an important question around race and infrastructure. I think I've missed this. I have missed. Yeah, I'd missed a slide. Sorry, so before we get to decolonising infrastructures, is to think about the history of infrastructures. And my work alongside Professor Catherine Yusof in the department, working with Dr Evansgaard, who's currently at University of East Anglia, but was at Queen Mary, and artist Michael Sellu, is that we form part of the Planetary Portals Collective. And our aim is to look at historical infrastructures in colonial Africa. So we've been looking at diamond mining and extractive industries, and how these continue in the present. You know, how the sort of like the extractive industries of colonialism actually opened up the continent for forms of exploitation and dispossession and poverty that continue today. So we draw parallels between, let's say, the diamond mining and the infrastructures that were built as a consequence of that. So the train lines, the shipping, the trade routes, how they were built, and how they are mirrored actually in, let's say, data infrastructures in Africa today. So how there's sort of this continuation of, let's say, sort of colonial imperatives to dominate the land, to subject people to dispossession and exploitation, how that continues. And that leads us to decolonizing infrastructures, in asking sort of what is the future of infrastructure? Can we continue to build infrastructure at, you know, at rates that we have done? These are heavily polluting structures. They have huge carbon footprints. So how do we not only sort of adapt infrastructure to be more environmentally conscious, but how do we make them more just and more equal? So how can we ensure in the life cycle of infrastructures that there's no exploitation that takes place? That mining is seen as important, let's say, as coding. If we come back to the Alexa, the anatomy of AI, the Alexa device, we think about the people that mine the rare earth materials that make digital or data infrastructures possible, but under very exploitative conditions. So in geography, we can expose these relationships. We can show how, you know, miners are just as important as, let's say, coders or engineers or technicians. And we can look at the forms of inequality between them. But a question in decolonizing infrastructures is, how do we take that forward? So, and that is a question like for your generation too, who are going to work in some of these areas. Like, how do these issues come to the fore in the design and the commissioning of infrastructures, and also taking into account the life cycle of infrastructures, that they begin and end in many different parts of the world, and they involve many different kinds of people and communities in that life cycle. So I've got a bit mixed up. They've gone, I don't know what happened to the slides. They've got a bit out of order. But a lot of work in geography then is about rethinking, and to come back to the starting point of this presentation is to take you perhaps beyond infrastructures as just technical or engineering feats and material objects, to seeing the social, political, geographical dimensions. So a lot of investment in geography and teaching you, and particularly what I teach in geography, is about, you know, getting you to rethink infrastructures and to see the bigger picture, to see them in the context of their history, their society, you know, their global kind of context. But also, one of the interesting things in rethinking infrastructure and studying infrastructures is that they're not always used as expected. And in different contexts, they can mean very different things. And I've got two examples here. So a very sort of influential geographer, Abu Malik Simone, wrote a paper called People as Infrastructure, where he sort of studied, well, he wandered around Johannesburg, studying kind of infrastructures in Johannesburg, and he came to the sort of realization that people actually connect a lot of infrastructures in Johannesburg, because it's not a particularly well-serviced city. It's kind of an old city too. It has a history of mining at its heart, gold mining. And he started to think about how people were essential, or people, he calls, his paper is called People as Infrastructure. So how people form the links between different kinds of infrastructure to make the city make sense, or to make the city work, so that people can buy stuff or people can get places, you know, so that goods and services circulate Johannesburg. Malik Simone argues that they actually people fill in here. They fill in gaps in infrastructures. And it's largely done through speech. It's largely done through talking. So it's a lot of informal, on the ground forms of communication between different groups of people that connect to other groups. So they form the kind of the network, if you like, in order to circulate goods and services and forms of knowledge around the city. So he calls that people as infrastructure. And we probably see that a lot more than what we think we do. People are probably essential to infrastructures working well and do a lot of work to make infrastructures function well. In my own work around data infrastructures in Africa, and I look at how young people are being trained, like leagues of young people are being trained in machine learning and coding. And computing is very cheap and it's very light. So all you need is a laptop, some cloud storage and access to the internet. And you can start coding in different ways and collecting data and modeling and predicting in different ways. So our interest is in how young people are using digital technologies and data infrastructures in their everyday lives through informal economies. And some of that work has explored what we call maker communities, who are it's quite an inventive, kind of artistic kind of practice of bringing together lots of unexpected bits of technology to produce new objects and perhaps even new ways of working with technology or even understanding what it means. So it's kind of like an artistic kind of practice that takes place in universities in East Africa and in West Africa too. So we're interested in that, this sort of reuse, if you like, or the retooling of data infrastructures. How are they used in unexpected ways, and what does it matter? Context matters, doesn't it, in terms of how people relate to infrastructures, and they're not the same everywhere. So I just want to conclude, and I hope that I didn't go too fast, but I've got some questions along the way too. I mean, an important question for you as prospective geography students and coming to Queen Mary as well is that how can we build better infrastructures? How does geography contribute? How do we promote justice and equality in infrastructures and sustainability and environmental protection? And again, just to reiterate, you know, that we want to think beyond infrastructures as feats of engineering and technology, to understand them as collections of people and different forms of labour and expertise, part of global production change and globalising, mobilising and driving globalisation. How they engage extractive and carbon industries to think about climate change and sustainability. How they attract global capital and investment, and how they exert forms of power and authority in the world. So geographers are keenly invested in many of the kind of human and environmental dimensions and dynamics of infrastructures and how to solve some of the problems that they present. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kerry. Sorry, we have gone slightly over, but hopefully our attendees will be able to stay for about another 5 or so minutes for questions and also to hear from Artie. No problem at all. If you do have to leave now, if you could kindly fill in the survey, I'm going to pop in the chat box. That would be great, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one. But the floor is open to you all now, so feel free to pop in your questions to either Kerry about her talk or Artie about general student life questions.
So I saw a question in the chat earlier about why I chose human geography instead of physical geography, so maybe I could just talk about that. I guess it was down to personal preference of what I'm more interested in. So I really enjoy looking at how communities are affected by physical geography problems or issues you would naturally think of physical geography, but actually can be looked at from a human perspective. And I'm really interested in like geopolitics and how those issues affect economies and people around the world. So I guess that was my own personal preference for choosing human geography over physical geography. But at Queen Mary, regardless of whether you're on BA or BSc, you still have the option to choose modules on the BA course or on the BSc course. So for example, I'm interested in climate change, but not necessarily the physical geography side, but how that affects peoples and communities. So I did a module on climate change, which was a BA geography course, but there were a lot of physical geographers on that as well. So I really enjoyed that at Queen Mary, that you're able to choose modules that you're specifically interested in that can overlap on BSc or BA, which I think is really nice because you can really tailor your course to what you're interested in. And in your first year, everyone will have the same compulsory module, so everyone starts at the same level, has the same sort of understanding, because you might have all done different things at A level. So I think that's really nice in first year, and then from second year and third year you get to choose things you're interested in. So some of the modules that I've really enjoyed doing, I did a module on geopolitics post 9/11, which I thought was really interesting to look at, like increased security around the world and how that disproportionately affects certain groups of people, which I thought was quite interesting. But then I've also done a module on urban water, so there's like a big difference of things you could choose to study. I've also looked at cultural geographies, historical geographies of medicine, so there's a huge range of modules which I'm really interested in, so that's why I chose human geography. I hope that answered your question. I'm more than happy to answer any more questions you guys may have. So the difference between BA and BSc, so BA is the Bachelor of Arts and BSc is the Bachelor of Sciences, but that's mainly physical geography, and BA is human geography. But as I said before, you're able to choose modules from either, so you can tailor to what you're interested in.
There's a difference in terms of the pathway.
Mm-hmm.
Is that with the BSc you will do methods and training in physical geography in the first and second year, and you won't have access to some of the human geography modules in the third year. So there is a pathway. You will, the BSc, they're both structured around different pathways and different forms of training. So the BSc is training in physical geography and the BA is training in human geography. And there is some overlap, as Artie says, you know, you do have some flexibility, but generally you'll be on a pathway that corresponds to whether getting a BSc or a BA.
Yeah. So someone asked a question that they're unsure which pathway to go down. I would say go onto the university website and look at the modules that are offered and see which ones you think you're interested in, or which ones you think you may be interested in, because naturally you'll find that you enjoy things more than other topics. So I think that's a good starting point to look at the course content. And then from there, sometimes there's suggested readings, for example, that you could look at, which you might be interested in. And then from that, I think you'll be able to make a decision of what you're interested in. There's another question about geography at A level. So yes, I did geography at A level. I think the main difference at university is the depth you go into each topic. So there's some topics I thought I would never cover at university level. For example, in second year, I did a module on colonial lives and afterlives, which I never thought for some reason was geography, for example. I thought that was more history, but that was something that I really enjoyed looking at. And then from that, in third year, I found that I was really interested in the historical geographies of medicine, and we looked at the links to imperialism there and colonialism, which I thought was really, really interesting. But I think the main difference is the depth you're able to go into and the level of expertise of the lecturers that are teaching you. So a lot of my research that I've done for my dissertation was on homelessness, and John May is one of the professors in the department, and he was very helpful to some of the work I did and could carry out. And I think that level of expertise, having someone whose research is shaping the field, I think that's really the big difference at university, having people you could go to. You're reading these people's work that are shaping the field, and I think that's really something that's quite cool at Queen Mary. For field trips, so I was affected by COVID. So in the first couple of years of my degree, I didn't have field trips, but they were online. But now they're all back in person and running again. But recently I went on a field trip to Belfast and we looked at the political geography there, and the differences between like nationalists and unionists and how that's shaping like the landscape and like the political geography in Belfast. And I really enjoyed having the field trip and going and seeing Belfast myself, because I don't think I ever would have gone to Belfast without having that field trip there. And it's really nice to see what you're learning in person and how it relates and how it does shape everyday lives. So that's one of the field trips that I've been on. But depending on your course, on which modules you take, there are different field trips available. So like Kerry said, there's a New York module. So I did that module in second year, but because of COVID, I couldn't go on that trip. But then I saw this year, some of my friends have been on the trip this year to New York, which is really exciting.
We went to New York this year, which is fantastic. I think the students had a blast, because it's a very exciting city, and one of our concerns, of course, the field trip is intellectually very stimulating on nature in the city, and doing a lot of work around New York's history, thinking about its infrastructures, thinking about light in the city. So it's an incredibly interesting module, but it's an expensive city, and that's always one of our concerns. But talking to students who went this year, it seemed to be fine. They seem to cope okay. A lot saved up, of course, so that's kind of the advice to give you if you want to do. There's 2 American field trips, one to Boston, one to New York. If you want to do one of those in your second or third year, is to save up if you to go, as you would with any field trip, actually, that you want to have some freedom in the city. So, and New York was popping, really, because it was the weather was amazing. It was warm, it was blue sky, so the city, it makes a huge difference in terms of what we can do in the city. Everything outside, we can give lectures outside, we can walk around the city a lot and really take it all in and give the students a lot of autonomy and independence in the city too, to move around it, to get to know it. So, and there's a lot you get to know each other as well, which is really important. So the sense that I got this year is that people made a lot of great friends, and they did a lot of things together as a big group. So they went to a baseball game, and I think a lot of students went on food odysseys, for lack of a better word to describe it, because it's a great culinary city, of course, with food from all over the world. So I think a lot of people just went out and found great, quite cheap places to eat that were just fantastic. So it was really nice to hear students actually, beyond the module content, really getting to know the city and having a great time out there. So it was very rewarding. I think.
So I've seen just a couple more questions. There was one about academic support for students. So I think the support at Queen Mary is really good, because you have your tutors that you can go to if there's any issues that come up at all. But also you have PASS, which is a peer assisted support group where you can go, and that's run by other students in years higher than first year, and they can provide help if you're struggling with anything, for example, like references, reading, just tips that you may be shy to go to for your lecturer for, but you may want to ask another student. That's a really nice chilled space where you can go and ask other students for help, and that runs weekly because I was a PASS mentor in second year. But there's also in-sessional modules which you can choose. So they're outside of the School of Geography, I believe, and you can select those modules, and they help with things like referencing, note-taking, just issues like that may come up. So I think there's a lot of academic support available to students, but I think going to your tutor, which you're assigned, that usually stays with you from your first year to your third year, for any issues you have at all, and they can give you more specific guidance of who to go to with any issues you may have. And there was a question about accommodation. So I stayed in a student accommodation in my first year, and I'm not sure about whether it's guaranteed or not, but I think if you apply by the given deadline, I'm sure you will be able to secure your accommodation, given that you follow that giving in your deposit and meeting all the deadlines. I'm sure there is availability. But I stayed in Fielding House, and that was with 11 other people, and I think that puts people off because it's a huge number of people. But for me, I personally preferred that because you're more likely to meet people that perhaps have the same interests as you and more friends. So that's, yeah, I really recommend if you do have the opportunity to stay in student accommodation, I think it's a really great opportunity. But if not, Queen Mary do run other events that are catered for like commuter students as well. So there's a mix for everyone to get involved with. There's a question about exams and coursework. So for me, I've only ever done coursework. So I've had no exams. I've had seen exams, but those are essentially coursework, so you get a given time to do it, and that's just based on the modules you choose. So some of the modules you can see before what assessment they have, but I would say not to choose the module based on the assessment, because if you enjoy the module, then you will do well in the exam because you're more likely to put in the work in something you enjoy. So I wouldn't be put off, for example, if one module had an exam or another had coursework. Mine just naturally happened to all just have coursework. But yeah, I think in a lot of human geography modules, a lot of the assessments are coursework based. So you get your essay question at the start of the module, or sometimes they're released a few weeks in, and then from then you can just plan your essays and your assignments. Some modules also have presentations that you can do, so there's a range of assessments, and it's all different based on the modules you choose.
There is a range of assessments. So as Archie said, you know, presentations, essays, I think also podcasts have been used too. So yeah, so the idea is to introduce you as a student to writing different kinds of reports in a way, or different kinds of essays. So I think in climate change policy, you write a policy report, is that right? So yeah, so you kind of get you into the habit of perhaps producing different kinds of work for different audiences in a way. So yeah, so there is a diversity of coursework. I have a question at first, what tips would I give? Okay. I think to enjoy it, you know, to enjoy the subject, and to, you know, not worry so much about some of the other pressures that come in, which are inevitable in a way, but to try, you know, embrace the subject and enjoy it, and enjoy your first year. One tip that I would give to all students at every level is to form reading groups with each other. You know, the demands on degree level is a bit of a change of gear from A level in terms of critical thinking, let's call it, sort of like reading and interpreting and basically writing about new material as well. And I would say, you know, reading groups are great for getting to know people, making new friends. They can be done informally, and you can actually get through quite a bit of reading as a group. So you can, you know, 3 or 4 of you get together and you divvy up the reading for a particular module. You can get through a lot, and you can exchange notes, and ultimately it will benefit your grades. So rather than struggling alone with a text, or, you know, reading alone, is that you read with others. And just, I mean, that would be a tip that I would give all students at whatever level, is, I mean, to work, like, to support each other as well. I mean, and, you know, enjoy that experience of being in university, making new friends, learning new things. Yeah, I mean, that's the tip I would give you. It's a long time since I was an undergraduate, so
I think we have one more question. I'm not sure if you answered this, Artie. What would you like to do after your degree?
A very daunting question that I get a lot, but I'm looking at doing a master's, so further study, and I'm hoping to stay at Queen Mary for that. And I'm looking at doing global development and health geographies, because that's something I'm really interested in. And that was inspired mainly by the modules I chose, and I found that I really enjoyed it. And I think it's something that's very relevant in today's society, especially with COVID-19. It really like highlights how important health geographies are, and like global health inequalities and development geographies. I think that was really exposed by the pandemic. So it's something that I'm really interested in and look forward to going into. But yeah, I think further studies is the way I want to go forward at the moment. One thing about that, I think Queen Mary has been quite helpful in trying to, you know, make you think about what you want to do after your degree. So I took part in something called Q Taster, which is you sign up and you get to choose 3 different companies and you get to go to talks run by them, and that really helps you find out what you're interested in and what you're not interested in. So this might be quite silly, but I didn't realize Expedia was a tech company, or they focus primarily a lot on tech, and I didn't realize that until I went and visited the offices themselves and they highlighted the different roles that they offer. And from that I realized I'm actually not interested in tech roles, but I wouldn't have known that unless I had gone through Q Taster and had the opportunity to visit these different companies. So I think Queen Mary is quite good in the sense that they try to push you to think about what you want to do before you come to the end of 3rd year and you feel a bit lost and maybe don't know what to do. So I think it's quite good that you start thinking about that from the day you arrive at Queen Mary. And Queen Mary have their own like School of Geography's careers team as well, which is really good. And there's like have different internships available as well. But yeah, back to the main question was further studies. That's something that I'm interested in doing after university.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Artie and Kerry. Maybe we'll give it 1 more minute for any final questions before we wrap up. So if you do want to get in any questions, you have 60 seconds.
Oh, why did you choose Queen Mary? I think that's just coming. Yeah.
For me, I wanted a campus university, and Queen Mary is the only campus university. So I'm from London, and like anyways, but I still wanted to move out to get that experience, especially as I said before, because of COVID, a lot of my things were online. So having that experience to stay in student accommodation and meet other people that weren't on my course, that was a big reason of why I chose Queen Mary. But also just the modules itself, I think they vary a lot. So that's something I would recommend looking at, is like the course before you come to Queen Mary or other unis, for example, and seeing what modules you're really interested in. But that was the main factor of me choosing Queen Mary out of other London universities. And I think having a campus university to study on is really nice. And I think that does make a big difference in like uni experience, I guess, because everything is in one place. Like all your study facilities are in one place, but also there's Drapers, there's the student gym as well, which is all in one area. So it makes it really nice to just study, to socialize. I think it's a really nice space together.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Artie. I think we will wrap up there and stop there. I know we've taken quite a bit more of your time today. We'll stay on for another minute or so for anyone who wants to talk to us, but hopefully you enjoyed this talk, and we'll see you at our next one in a couple of weeks' time. But like I said before, if you could fill in the survey in the chat, that would be great. We'd love to know how you found today. Thank you all for joining. Have a great evening.
So okay.